Welcome to the Federal Transit Administration's presentation on the Small Starts project type under the Capital Investment Grants Program, otherwise known as the CIG Program. My name is Dan from the Office of Capital Project Development within the Office of Planning and Environment, and I will be guiding you through this presentation. There are 37 slides in this presentation, and the training will take about 30 minutes to complete. This presentation will cover 4 topics. First, a general overview of the CIG program is provided. Then, Small Starts project eligibility requirements are discussed. Then, the requirements for getting into and through the steps in the Small Starts process. And finally, the Small Starts evaluation and rating process is described. While this presentation hopefully provides a helpful overview, FTA strongly encourages project sponsors to familiarize themselves with the CIG regulation, policy guidance, and reporting instructions found on our website at transit.dot.gov. It is important for project sponsors to understand fully the requirements of the CIG program. First, let's start with a brief overview of the Capital Investment Grants Program. The CIG program is a competitive discretionary grant program funded from the General Fund of the Treasury. Unlike many other FTA grant programs, the funding is not tied to a funding formula in law. Congress decides through its annual appropriations process how much funding the CIG program receives each year. Historically, the CIG program has received between $1.8 and $2.5 billion per year in congressional appropriations. Demand for CIG funding greatly exceeds the funding available. Because of the competitive nature of the program, the average CIG share for most projects is 50% or less of the project capital cost. The program has a successful history of investing in transit infrastructure around the country. In the last decade, the CIG program has provided over $18 billion to dozens of new or extended transit systems throughout the United States. These transit capital projects are transformational to the regions they serve. They create manufacturing and construction jobs, generate economic development, and improve the quality of people's lives by connecting people to jobs and activity centers. There are 3 types of eligible projects under the CIG program: New Starts, Small Starts, and Core Capacity. The 3 project types are briefly described on this slide. New Starts projects are new fixed guideway projects or extensions to existing fixed guideway systems. New Starts projects have a total estimated capital cost greater than $300 million or are seeking $100 million or more in CIG program funds. Small Starts projects are new fixed guideway projects, extensions to existing fixed guideway systems, or corridor-based bus rapid transit projects. Small Starts projects have a total estimated capital cost of $300 million or less and are seeking less than $100 million in CIG program funds. And finally, Core Capacity projects are substantial corridor-based improvement projects that will expand capacity by at least 10% in an existing fixed guideway corridor that is at or over capacity today or will be in 5 years. The focus of the remainder of this presentation is on Small Starts projects. For further information on New Starts and Core Capacity, please visit the FTA website. There you can find similar recorded presentations on both New Starts and Core Capacity. The requirements and law for the CIG program are quite detailed and extensive. Projects seeking CIG funding must go through a multi-year, multi-step process before they are eligible for and may receive CIG funds. FTA is required to evaluate and rate projects at various points during the process. CIG funding is awarded at the end of the multi-year, multi-step process when a construction grant is awarded by FTA. Larger cost projects typically have their CIG funding paid out over multiple federal fiscal years, subject to annual congressional appropriations. Smaller cost projects, however, can sometimes receive all of their requested CIG funding from existing appropriations. Congressional notifications are required at various points in the CIG process. FTA must perform project oversight. FTA is required to prepare an annual report to Congress that serves as a companion document to the President's annual budget submission to Congress. The report must contain proposed funding levels for the CIG program and project ratings. Lastly, New Starts and Core Capacity CIG project sponsors must perform a before and after study comparing cost and ridership estimates prepared during planning of the project against actual cost and ridership figures 2 years after the project opens for service. Before and after studies are not required for small starts projects. Now we'll discuss in further detail small starts eligibility requirements. Eligible small starts projects include new fixed guideway projects, extensions to existing fixed guideway systems, or corridor-based bus rapid transit projects. The law defines a fixed guideway project as using and occupying a separate right-of-way for the exclusive use of public transportation, using rail, or using a fixed catenary system. Eligible transportation modes under CIG include heavy rail, light rail, commuter rail, streetcars, and bus rapid transit projects. More information will be provided on bus rapid transit eligibility for small starts in the next few slides. Lastly, as discussed earlier, the law specifies that small starts projects must have a total estimated capital cost of $300 million or less and must be seeking less than $100 million in CIG funds. Bus rapid transit is a high-quality, bus-based transit service that delivers fast and efficient service. The law defines two types of BRT that are eligible as small starts projects: fixed guideway BRT and corridor-based BRT. In the next few slides, we will discuss the similarities and differences of these two types of BRT in terms of eligibility for small starts. These pictures provide visual images noting the distinction between fixed guideway BRT and corridor-based BRT. A fixed guideway BRT is one in which the bus operates in an exclusive bus lane for greater than 50% of the corridor during peak periods. By contrast, a corridor-based BRT is one in which the bus operates in mixed traffic for the majority of the corridor. The exclusive bus lane is not required to be physically separated. As shown in the image on the slide, it could simply be noted as exclusive to buses through the use of signage, striping, or paint. Other traffic may be allowed to make turning movements from the exclusive lane. The law requires that both types of BRT must include a substantial investment in a defined corridor as demonstrated by features that emulate the services provided by rail fixed guideway public transportation systems. In the next slide, we'll describe the additional features that must be included in BRT projects seeking CIG funding. This slide provides the definitions found in law for fixed guideway BRT and corridor-based BRT. The definitions are very similar. Both types of BRT must include defined stations, traffic signal priority, and short headway bidirectional services for a substantial part of weekdays. There are two distinctions in the law between a fixed guideway BRT and a corridor-based BRT, as shown in the underlined text on the slide. The first distinction, as described on the previous slide, is that a project can qualify as a fixed guideway BRT only if the majority of the project operates in an exclusive bus lane during peak periods. The second distinction is that a fixed guideway BRT must include short headway bidirectional service for a substantial part of weekends as well as weekdays. In the next slide, we will look further at the requirements that apply to both types of BRT. As shown on the last slide, the law states that a BRT project in the CIG program must include features that emulate the services provided by rail, including defined stations, traffic signal priority, short headway bidirectional services for a substantial part of the day, and any other features the Secretary of the United States Department of Transportation may determine are necessary. This slide shows how FTA defines each of those BRT features. The project must include defined stations that are accessible for persons with disabilities, offer shelter from the weather, and provide information on schedules and routes. The project must include active signal priority in a separated guideway, in either queue jump lanes or active signal priority in non-separated guideway. The project must include short headway bidirectional service for at least a 14-hour span of service on weekdays applicable to both fixed guideway and corridor-based BRTs, and at least a 10-hour span on weekends, applicable to fixed guideway BRT only. On weekdays, both fixed guideway and corridor-based BRTs must provide either 15-minute maximum headways throughout the day or 10-minute maximum headways during peak periods and 20-minute maximum headways at all other times. On weekends, Fixed guideway BRT projects must provide 30-minute maximum headways. And finally, FTA requires the BRT service to have a brand identity for stations and vehicles. Now that we have explained eligibility for small starts, we will turn our attention to the steps for getting into and through the CIG process for proposed small starts projects. This flowchart displays the steps in law that small starts projects must complete to be eligible for and receive small starts funds. Prior to requesting entry into the CIG program, project sponsors often perform feasibility studies or other local planning studies. The first phase of the CIG process for small starts projects is entitled Project Development. A project sponsor applies to FTA for entry into project development by submitting a short letter to the FTA Associate Administrator for Planning and Environment. The law does not require FTA to evaluate and rate the project before allowing its entry into project development. Once a project is accepted into the project development phase by FTA, the project sponsor must complete certain activities required by law. These activities include selecting a locally preferred alternative, getting the locally preferred alternative adopted into the fiscally constrained Metropolitan Transportation Plan, completing the environmental review process required under the National Environmental Policy Act, and developing sufficient information for FTA to develop a project rating. To complete the project development phase, FTA requires project sponsors to complete sufficient engineering and design to develop a firm and reliable cost, scope, and schedule for the project, obtain all non-CIG funding commitments, complete all critical third-party agreements, and meet other FTA readiness requirements related to technical capacity, staffing, and oversight to be eligible for a construction grant agreement. The law requires FTA to evaluate and rate small starts projects prior to awarding a construction grant, as shown on the chart by a yellow arrow. By law, a project must receive at least a medium overall rating to be eligible for a construction grant agreement. In the next few slides, we will go into more detail on each of these steps. Project sponsors decide the right time to apply for entry into project development. An application may be submitted to FTA at any time throughout the year. Project sponsors do not need to tie the timing of their request to FTA's preparation of the annual report on funding recommendations, which typically occurs in the fall. In fact, it is best not to apply during that time, as FTA is very busy with those activities. When deciding the timing for seeking entry into project development, a project sponsor should consider its estimated time frame for performing planning and design work and obtaining funding commitments. Because of the desire by Congress and the industry to ensure the CIG process moves quickly, FTA requires project sponsors to demonstrate sufficient progress to remain in the CIG program. Thus, FTA requires that project sponsors obtain commitments of at least 50% of all non-CIG funds within 3 years of a small starts project's advancement into the project development phase, and continue to make sufficient progress on advancing the level of project design during that time. Project sponsors wishing to request entry into the project development phase must submit a short 2 to 5 page letter to FTA that includes the information outlined in the CIG policy guidance found on our website. The request letter should be submitted electronically to FTA for faster delivery. There is no standard format for the letter. It should be a short letter that includes the people and organizations that will be working on the proposed project, a map and description of the proposed corridor, the transportation problem that is being addressed by the proposed project, the current transit service operated in the corridor, a description of the proposed project, including its cost and the amount of CIG funding being sought, if that is currently known, a high-level project schedule, the estimated cost to conduct the PD work. Most importantly, as shown in red bolded text on this slide, in a project sponsor's request to enter project development, it must demonstrate to FTA that funding is available and committed to perform the project development work. Project sponsors must have money available to begin the project development work immediately upon entry into the CIG program. Funding available 1 or more years in the future does not qualify as available and committed for entry into project development, even if it is programmed in an official funding document or budget. Because the law intends for projects to make quick progress and not linger in the CIG program, FTA requires that funding be available to begin performing project development work immediately upon entry into the CIG program. Upon receipt of a request to enter project development, FTA reviews the request to ensure it contains all of the information required in FTA's CIG policy guidance. Upon receipt of complete information, FTA processes the request and notifies Congress and the project sponsor in writing within 45 days whether the information was deemed sufficient for entry into project development. As noted on the last slide, providing documentation to FTA that funding is available and committed to do the project development work is a key requirement for gaining entry into project development. This slide discusses the types of supporting documentation that project sponsors might submit to demonstrate the commitment of funds. If federal funding will be used to pay for project development, the project sponsor must provide FTA with a copy of the Unified Planning Work Program, shown on the slide as UPWP, or the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, shown on the slide as STIP, showing that federal funds are programmed to the project. CIG funding is not available to pay for project development activities, although the cost of these activities can be reimbursed later with CIG funds when and if a construction grant agreement is provided by FTA in the future. If state or local funding will be used to pay for project development, the project sponsor must describe the source or sources of funding being used and provide supporting documentation to FTA showing the commitment of these funds. A statement that there is an intent to commit funds in the future is not sufficient. FTA needs to know that the money exists and is currently approved so that PD activities can begin as soon as the project enters the CIG program. This slide includes a list of some possible examples of supporting documentation that might demonstrate commitment of state or local funds, but each area of the country is unique, and these may or may not be applicable to your area. Examples include an adopted budget, an adopted capital improvement program, a board resolution committing funding, a letter signed by an official authorized to commit the funds, or a copy of a law or referendum approving the funds. It is important to remember that FTA does not evaluate and rate projects prior to allowing them to enter project development. Thus, entry into project development is not a statement of project merit or an indication that the project will receive CIG funding from FTA in the future. Rather, it simply means that planning and design for the project can continue by the project sponsor. FTA strongly discourages project sponsors from touting entry into project development as a major milestone to the press and other local decision makers, as doing so misconstrues the CIG process. Once a small starch project has entered project development, the project sponsor must complete the environmental review process as required under the National Environmental Policy Act, shown on the slide as NEPA, select the locally preferred alternative, known as the LPA, get the LPA adopted into the region's fiscally constrained long-range transportation plan, prepare the information needed by FTA to conduct its evaluation and rating of the project, obtain commitments of all of the non-CIG funding, complete sufficient engineering and design work to develop a firm and reliable project scope, cost, and schedule, and complete all critical third-party agreements. Project sponsors should work closely with FTA throughout project development and especially in the last 6 months prior to an anticipated construction grant agreement. To receive a small starch construction grant agreement, a project sponsor must complete the steps in the CIG process previously discussed. The project must also be evaluated and rated by FTA and receive a medium or better overall rating. Generally speaking, the project must either be recommended for funding in FTA's annual report on funding recommendations or have received a CIG funding allocation from FTA to be considered for award of a small starch construction grant agreement. Before FTA will sign a small starch construction grant agreement with a project sponsor, all of the non-CIG funding must be committed to the project, all critical third-party agreements must be signed, and FTA readiness requirements must be met. These include the project sponsor developing a firm and final project cost, scope, and schedule, and demonstrating the technical capacity to complete the project. There are two types of construction grant agreements for small starch projects: single-year grant agreements and small starch grant agreements. Projects receiving single-year grant agreements go through an expedited process because all of the CIG funds being requested by the project sponsor have already been allocated to the project by FTA from existing congressional appropriations. Projects receiving a small starts grant agreement are those that require future federal fiscal year appropriations of CIG funds. The law requires that all small starts construction grant agreements be sent for a 10-day congressional notification period before the grant may be awarded. Now we will discuss the small starts evaluation and rating process. The law specifies that FTA is to use a 5-point rating scale as shown on this slide: low, medium, medium high, and high. Projects must receive a medium or better overall rating to advance through the CIG process and receive a construction grant agreement. Project ratings are also published in the Annual Report on Funding Recommendations, that is a companion document to the President's budget request to Congress each year. The next few slides discuss the rating criteria. This slide shows the statutory small starts evaluation criteria, which are further described in FTA CIG policy guidance on the FTA website. The law defines 2 types of evaluation criteria: project justification criteria, shown in blue, and local financial commitment criteria, shown in green. The project justification criteria for small starts projects are mobility improvements, environmental benefits, congestion relief, cost effectiveness, economic development, and land use. The law specifies that FTA evaluate the 6 project justification criteria and give, quote, comparable but not necessarily equal, end quote, weight to each when determining a summary project justification rating. Thus, FTA gives equal weight to each, meaning that each of the 6 is given a weight of 16.66% when determining the summary project justification rating. The local financial commitment criteria are current financial condition, weighted 25%, commitment of funds, weighted 25%, and reliability of the financial planning assumptions and financial capacity, weighted 50%. Ratings are assigned to each individual criterion via the 5-point scale mentioned on the previous slide, with a low being equal to a score of 1 and a high being equal to a score of 5. The individual criterion ratings are then weighted as described to generate the summary project justification rating and the summary local financial commitment rating. The summary ratings are then given equal weight in determining an overall project rating. However, FTA requires that a project receive a medium or better rating on each summary rating to receive a medium or better overall rating. In other words, both project justification and local financial commitment are important components to a successful project. A poor rating on one cannot be offset by a good rating on the other. Each criterion will be discussed in more depth on the next slides. This slide shows the 6 project justification criteria in law and the measures used to calculate each. FTA's CIG policy guidance on the FTA website describes in detail the measures, explains exactly how they are calculated, and provides the thresholds for ratings from low to high. Mobility improvements. FTA evaluates mobility improvements as the total number of linked trips using the proposed project, with a weight of 2 given to trips that would be made on the project by transit-dependent persons. Environmental benefits. FTA evaluates environmental benefits as a ratio of the dollar value of the environmental benefits produced by the project compared to the annualized federal share of the project. Congestion relief. FTA evaluates congestion relief based on the number of trips on the project that are new to transit. Cost effectiveness. The cost effectiveness measure is the annualized capital federal share of the project per trip on the project. Economic development. The measure of economic development evaluates how likely it is the project will induce additional transit supportive development in the future based on an examination of local plans and policies. Land use. The land use measure examines the existing corridor and station area development and character, pedestrian facilities and parking supply, and the proportion of existing affordable housing near the station areas compared to the proportion in the counties through which the project travels. Warrants allow a proposed small starts project to receive automatic medium ratings on some of the project justification criteria without having to submit detailed information to FTA. Projects that have a capital cost proportionate to the level of existing transit ridership in a strong established transit corridor have a high likelihood of success. Thus, FTA believes such projects can be evaluated more easily without the need for the project sponsor to prepare detailed ridership estimates. Warrants are optional. A project sponsor can choose to submit more detailed information to FTA if the sponsor believes ratings higher than medium may be possible. On the next slide, the parameters that qualify a project for project justification warrants are described. This slide shows the project capital cost and existing transit ridership parameters a project sponsor must demonstrate for its project to qualify for project justification warrants. The parameters are basically a sliding scale. The higher the capital cost of the project, the more existing transit ridership there must be in the corridor today to qualify for warrants. So if the cost of the project is under $50 million, the project sponsor must demonstrate that there are at least 3,000 existing transit riders in the corridor today. If the cost is between $50 and $100 million, the project sponsor must demonstrate at least 6,000 existing transit riders in the corridor today. If the cost is between $100 and $175 million, the project sponsor must demonstrate at least 9,000 existing transit riders in the corridor today. If the cost is between $175 and $250 million, the project sponsor must demonstrate at least 12,000 existing transit riders in the corridor today. And finally, if the cost is between $250 and $300 million, the project sponsor must demonstrate at least 15,000 existing transit riders in the corridor today. Project sponsors submit a letter to FTA requesting consideration for the use of warrants. The letter should document the estimated project cost, the requested CIG amount and share, and the current existing transit ridership in the corridor. The How to Apply webpage in the CIG section of the FTA website contains instructions on how to document existing transit ridership in the corridor. If a project sponsor chooses to be warranted, the project is warranted for mobility improvements, cost effectiveness, and congestion relief. Additionally, a simplified environmental benefits calculation is used for warranted projects. Project sponsors may not pick and choose which criteria are warranted. Project sponsors must develop ridership estimates for small starts projects that do not qualify for project justification warrants. Project sponsors may choose from 3 different approaches to develop ridership estimates: use of the local travel forecasting model, use of FTA's simplified trips on project software, known as STOPS, or incremental data-driven methods. The chosen forecasting method should be discussed with FTA well before the submittal of information by the project sponsor for project evaluation and rating. If a sponsor chooses to use its local travel forecasting model, FTA will need time to review the validity of the model and the reasonableness of the outcomes. This can be an iterative process. If a sponsor chooses to use STOPS, FTA's review time is usually much less. If a sponsor seeks to use an incremental data-driven method, it must be discussed with FTA so that FTA can understand the data available to the project sponsor and its usefulness in estimating trips on the project. Project sponsors must choose one of these approaches and then use that approach to develop all of the project justification measures. In other words, a sponsor cannot choose to use its local travel model to develop information for some of the evaluation criteria, and then try to use STOPS for other evaluation criteria. The remaining slides in this presentation describe the local financial commitment evaluation process for small starts projects. The law specifies that each proposed source of capital and operating financing must be stable, reliable, and available within the proposed project timetable. FTA evaluates this for small starts projects in one of 2 ways: through the use of financial warrants or by the review of a financial plan submitted by the project sponsor. Financial warrants, like project justification warrants described earlier, are a pre-qualification approach that allows a project to receive automatic ratings on local financial commitment. Small starts projects can qualify for this highly simplified financial evaluation if the project sponsor can demonstrate it has a reasonable plan to secure funding for the non-CIG share of capital costs, the additional operating and maintenance costs to the agency of the proposed small starts project is less than 5% of the project sponsor's current approved operating budget, and the project sponsor is in reasonably good financial condition as demonstrated by the past 3 years' audited financial statements. Small starts projects that meet these requirements and request greater than 50% CIG funding will receive an automatic medium rating. The rating is boosted to high for projects that meet the items above and request 50% or less CIG funding. For small starts projects that cannot qualify for financial warrants, FTA requires the submittal of a financial plan so that it can evaluate and rate the local financial commitment. The central element of the financial plan is an agency-wide 20-year cash flow projection that includes the capital and operating costs and revenues for the agency as a whole, including the proposed CIG project. The financial plan and cash flow includes 5 to 10 years of historical data on revenues and costs. For each funding source, the financial plan describes whether the source is an existing source or a new source. For new funding sources, the plan describes the steps necessary to implement the sources and the anticipated date the sources would become effective. Importantly, the financial plan examines the assumptions used to estimate future costs and revenues. Assumptions about costs and revenues in the future should generally align with historical experience. If assumptions going forward are significantly different than the historical data show, the project sponsor must provide a justification for such assumptions. Project sponsors also submit supporting documentation, such as recent audited financial statements and bond offerings, that provide FTA with information on the current financial health of the agency. Lastly, project sponsors perform stress tests and sensitivity analyses of key variables in their financial plan and submit the results of such tests to FTA to demonstrate their ability to cover unanticipated cost overruns or funding shortfalls. For more details on the specific requirements of the financial plan, project sponsors should use the Guidance for Transit Financial Plans and CIG Reporting Instructions, both found on FTA's website. For a small starts project that does not qualify for financial warrants, the sponsor's submitted financial plan is evaluated and rated based on 3 criteria: current condition, 25% weight, commitment of funds, 25% weight, and reasonableness of assumptions and financial capacity, 50% weight. When the summary local financial commitment rating is calculated, FTA also takes into consideration the share of CIG funding requested. If the summary local financial commitment rating is rated at least medium, and the CIG share is less than 50% of the project's capital cost, then the summary local financial commitment rating is raised 1 level. The next few slides will go into more depth on each of the measures used in the local financial commitment evaluation process. FTA examines the current capital and operating condition of the project sponsor as one subfactor in its review of local financial commitment. When examining current condition, FTA looks at the average bus fleet age, bond ratings given within the last 2 years, the ratio of current assets to current liabilities from the most recent audited financial statement, and recent service history, including whether there have been any significant cuts in service. FTA places the greatest emphasis on the bus fleet age and current ratio. The current condition subfactor is weighted 25% when developing the summary local financial commitment rating. For the commitment of funds subfactor, FTA considers the percentage of funds, both capital and operating, that are committed or budgeted versus those only planned or unspecified. Funds are considered committed if sources have all the necessary approvals to be used to fund the proposed project without any additional actions. Funds are budgeted if sources have been budgeted and or programmed for use on the proposed project but are not yet fully committed, meaning the funds have not yet received legislative approval. Examples include debt financing in an agency-adopted CIP that has yet to receive final legislative approval, or state capital grants that have been included in the state budget but are still awaiting final legislative appropriations. Funds are considered planned if sources are identified and have a reasonable chance of being committed, but are neither committed nor budgeted. Funds are considered unspecified if sources are not sufficient or have not been clearly identified. If private contributions are included as a significant funding source in the financial plan, FTA raises this subfactor rating 1 level. The commitment of funds subfactor is weighted 25% when developing the summary local financial commitment rating. The third subfactor examined by FTA when evaluating local financial commitment is the reasonableness of assumptions used in the sponsor's financial plan and the resulting financial capacity. This includes an examination of future projections as compared to historical experience, the reasonableness of the project capital cost estimate, the adequacy of the financial plan in meeting the agency's state of good repair needs, and the sponsor's financial capacity to withstand unexpected cost increases or funding shortfalls above and beyond the contingency included in the project cost estimate. The reasonableness of the assumption/financial capacity subfactor is weighted 50% when developing the summary local financial commitment rating. This concludes the overview of the Small Starts project type under the Capital Investment Grants Program. For more information about the program, please visit FTA's website at www.transit.dot.gov or www.fta.dot.gov.